Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing anti-Asian racism, as we have previously on the show as well. We've discussed that more in the context of the U.S., but this time we want to hone in on the United Kingdom, and we're going to discuss healthcare workers there more specifically, and of course, anti-Asian racism as a whole within the context as well of the pandemic, where because of the pandemic and rhetoric on the part of politicians and others, there has been, a 300% increase in hate crimes against East and Southeast Asians. That's according to the campaign and advocacy group End the Virus of Racism. This is all, of course, within the United Kingdom that we're talking about. Now, healthcare workers, as I said, even the U.S., have been bearing the brunt of these sorts of feelings on the parts of patients as well as even colleagues and those in higher positions than them, treating them differently because of their East Asian, Southeast Asian background and the perception that the virus has been spread from Asia to the rest of the world. Now, of course, there's a lot of issues to unwrap here, right? So the fact that patients then start using slurs, etc., against these healthcare workers makes their job that much harder going forward and adds significant amounts of stress to already stressful jobs to begin with. And overall then as well creates this situation of insecurity just out and about on the streets altogether. So just as a layperson, when you're out on the streets, even not as a healthcare worker, you're still possibly in danger of even being physically attacked, as has happened a number of times, as we've seen on social media and otherwise. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Tom Matsuda, who is a journalist and writer. He's joining us today from London. Tom, thank you very much for your time today and for joining us here in Scope. There's a lot to, as I said, unravel here and discuss, but what are your thoughts about healthcare workers and how they've been treated and dealt with, as in their concerns about racism towards them ever since the pandemic has begun?
So just before I specifically deal with NHS healthcare workers, I'd like to briefly summarize the hate crimes that East Asian and South Asian people have been experiencing since the start of the pandemic. So last month, March, at the onset of the pandemic, a 23-year-old student, Jonathan Mock, was assaulted in Oxford Circus, so much so that he needed facial surgery. And the most recent publicized hate crime was the assault of Chinese University lecturer Peng Wan last month, who was attacked by a gang of men in Southampton. During this attack, they shouted things at him, such as Chinese virus, and told him to get out of the country. I think this gives kind of an extent to the problem and the issue of anti-Asian hate crime within the UK. And between March to September 2020, 56% of hate crimes recorded were directed at the East Asian community, and this was a threefold increase compared to data from the same time period of the previous year. And in regards specifically to Asian healthcare workers, Filipino health workers are the third largest nationality in NHS after UK citizens and Indians, but they have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. So as of December 2020, more Filipino healthcare workers have died of COVID-19 in the UK than in the Philippines. And as of October 2020, 40% of Filipino NHS health workers had died after contracting COVID-19. So in spite of the fact that they're so integral to the NHS, they have been proportionally affected. And even the first person to give the COVID-19 vaccine was actually a Filipino health worker named May Parsons. And I think that really reveals how integral they are to the NHS. In spite of this, they have reported experiencing discrimination since the pandemic started. So in January 2021, it was reported that a Filipino nurse was racially abused by one of his patients. And a survey in October last year also found that a quarter of nurses had witnessed racist behavior at work.
Right. Tom, I wonder what, in your opinion, is at the root cause of why we've had so much racism towards people of Asian backgrounds in the UK. In the US, it's easy to point to Donald Trump and his continuous rhetoric or the use of the word Chinese virus and Wuhan virus, etc. Is it the same case in the UK? I mean, is it down to politicians' rhetoric?
So I would definitely say that Donald Trump normalizing the usage of terms like Wuhan flu or Chinese virus has resulted in COVID-19 being associated with Chinese people. And then in a world, and specifically in the UK as well, that struggles to tell the difference between people of East Asian and Southeast Asian descent, this has meant that the community as a whole has been seen to be the harbingers of the virus. And we can actually see this with media representation. So since the start of the pandemic, certain outlets in the UK and around the world and in Europe have used pictures of East Asian and Southeast Asian people wearing masks when talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, even if the article has nothing to do with people of East Asian and Southeast Asian descent. And I think this has crystallized the view that these people are to blame for the pandemic. I also believe that there is a lack of reckoning with racism that happened to my community even before the pandemic. So, for example, to refer to Chinese takeaways, people have casually used the C slur. This kind of stuff is not really understood as being racist and is used in casual context. So I think, yeah, and I also think there's a kind of more of a historical context. If we look even further back, after World War II, hundreds of Chinese workers recruited by the Royal Navy to help the war effort were forcibly deported when they were deemed as undesirable elements. And this, all of the above, as I have said, has not really been addressed by the British authorities thus far.
So I know that there are a lot of grassroots movements and a lot of groups within the UK who are trying to tackle this issue. I mean, I got through quite a few names, and I found quite a few names while doing research for this show. Is that where hope lies then? Is it through grassroots awareness and campaigns where, through educating, hopefully, the public that this will be dealt with?
Yes, well, it's my hope that through these grassroots movements, we can achieve education, which leads to East Asian and Southeast Asian stories in the UK being uplifted. I mean, in the UK, in regards to political representation of this community, as far as I'm aware, there are only 2 British East Asian MPs in Parliament. And I think Sarah Owen last year in a speech towards MPs said that she'd actually seen Tory ministers sharing COVID jokes with caricatures of a person in a Chinese pointy hat. She also said that a Tory council leader said in a meeting that this was all referring to the pandemic because someone was eating undercooked bat soup in China. And according to her, these were not at all addressed by the party. I would like to get to a point where we're looking at these racist incidents and calling them out as a society. But I believe the UK is not there yet. And I hope that these grassroots movements can help nudge the UK into being at that place.
Very well, Tom. The clock has gotten the best of us. We really appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule to share your insight with us. That was Tom Matsuda speaking to us there from London. We were discussing their overall anti-Asian racism within the UK in the context of the pandemic, something I mentioned in the introduction as well. This has happened not just in the UK, but in the US and in other countries, both in Europe, Australia, et cetera, et cetera. The list is quite endless, unfortunately. And this is all down to the rhetoric, the normalization of the idea that this entire virus has come out because of Asians overall. The Chinese virus, something that a phrase used by Donald Trump, the Wuhan flu, as Tom there mentioned, as well as another phrase that has been used by Donald Trump while he was in office. And all of that rhetoric has not helped. There are historical contexts to this sort of racism. So it's not like this racism is brand new either. This sort of racism has existed in these places before, but it's become significantly more exacerbated because of the pandemic, and all of the prejudices and bias have come to the fore. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss Joe Biden's first 100 days in office, and we're going to try to discuss more of his foreign policy challenges and policies ever since he has come into office. Now, the biggest concern, of course, on the part of many around the world allies as well as adversaries has been the fact that during the Trump years, we had the U.S. walk back a lot of policies that had been agreed upon in previous years, for example, under the Obama tenure or even under previous presidents' tenures as well. And so this sort of dilly-dallying, if I may use that phrase, is something that has concerned a lot of, as I said, allies and foes around the world, because it then creates this atmosphere where we're just not sure what's going to happen the next time there's a U.S. election and another president comes into office. If he or she is a Republican, for example, does that mean he or she will completely walk back, for example, Biden's policies? What then does that mean for then continuity on the part of U.S. foreign policies in general? Let's discuss that and other issues a bit further as well. We're now joined by Dr. Bledar Prifti, who is an associate professor of political science. He's also the author of U.S. Foreign Policy in the Middle East, The Case for Continuity. He is joining us this morning from Clearwater, Florida. Joining us this morning from South Bend, Indiana, is Dr. Michael Desch, who is professor of and chair at the Department of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. Michael and Bledar, good morning to you both, and thank you both for joining us. Michael, I'd like to start with you, if I may. Cooperation, at least under Donald Trump's tenure, had a very different definition, didn't it? It was more seemingly an isolationist policy under him. Do you think that Biden has been able to successfully, within these 100 days, come out of that more isolationist mindset?
Historically, the differences between the Trump administration and the Biden administration are quite stark. I think, though, that I'd go out on a limb and predict that what people are going to remark on a year from now is the elements of continuity between the two administrations. And the most obvious element of continuity, of course, was President Biden's decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan, not by May 1st, which was the Trump deadline, but by September 11th of this year. And I think you're going to see a lot of other examples of a big rhetorical gap between Trump and Biden, but a smaller substantive gap. And I'd be happy to talk about some, concrete areas. But that would be my prediction.
Indeed. And, Michael, there makes a very good point, doesn't he, that a lot of the policies, in fact, that we are seeing, or I wouldn't say a lot of them, but some of them at least that I've observed and seen and read about, do seem like pretty much this is the continuity of Trump, but just masked with I don't know, better rhetoric or more positive rhetoric, if I may use that term.
I would agree with you and Professor Desch as well. And the reason here is because when we talk about foreign policy, we're talking about, the national interest of the country and the strategies to implement or to advance those strategies. Those interests. So in this case, in order for us to claim that foreign policy, there has been change in U.S. foreign policy, we need to prove that there has been a change in U.S. interests and also in the strategies to advance those interests. So that is not the case here, and that has not been the case also in the last, let's say, few decades. So that's why we have seen this continuity in U.S. foreign policy, because what it means in reality is just a continuation of the same U.S. interests and strategies to advance those interests. So I agree that there is a change in rhetoric, but other than that, I don't see any major change, and I don't expect any major change in the future, for that matter.
Michael, what does this mean then for traditional allies? So I'm talking about Europe, for example. Under Donald Trump, we know that he had major disagreements with some of Europe's biggest leaders, be it Merkel, Macron, or others. Will Biden walk that all back? Has he been able to walk that back? Is that even the goal here at this point in time? Does this mean that the relationship across the oceans has forever changed?
I think that it has changed in a couple of ways. First of all, my colleague has pointed out that, ultimately it's the interests of the United States that are going to shape U.S. foreign policy. And I think the world in the past quarter of a century has changed very dramatically. And that's going to be reflected, for example, in U.S. relations with Europe. The United States and the Europeans have different interests these days. They're sort of papered over, by a common concern about developments within Russia and some elements of Russian foreign policy. But again, once you scratch the surface, the U.S. and Europe are not on the same page, or let's say Europe itself is divided on some of those big issues. So I think you will get we'll be back to the rhetoric of Atlanticism in terms of U.S.-European relations, but in terms of the reality, this is no longer Cold War Europe. It is post-Cold War Europe, and post-Cold War Europe is going to be a different place than it was a quarter of a century ago.
So, Bledar, I don't want to overstate this, but I mean, does a changed relationship with Europe mean that the Europe will need to, obviously logically, need to chart its own path and figure out its own way of doing things, and then B, that then signifies immediately a diminished role for the U.S. around the world?
I don't think that. I think that in this case, we have a change in the nature of the threat and the direction of the threat. So during the Cold War, we had the threat coming from the Soviet Union. Now the main threat to U.S. national interest is coming from China. So that's why even President Obama realized that and started to kind of reallocate basically our military resources and foreign policy, to the direction of the China. So now it's not that the U.S. foreign policy has changed. Its interest is the same, to prevent the emergence of a dominant power. It used to be the Soviet Union, now it is China. So it's the same interests, but it is a different, in this case, in focus. And the focus in this case is China. That's why we are talking about Europe in this case, because Europe is not very important to the US right now, because there is not a significant threat coming from Russia. And also, Russia does not have the potential that the Soviet Union used to have. So in this case, Europe alone, Western Europe, is able to contain Russia. The focus is on China now. That's why the U.S. needs a NATO-like alliance in Asia instead of, kind of focusing on the NATO in Europe. So that's why we have a change in the threat and the nature of threat coming from China, but we don't see any change in interest, because it's the same interest, just preventing the emergence of a dominant power. And doing the same thing all over. So I expect the U.S. to kind of work on building on a coalition, like in NATO, in Asia, and kind of, look at Europe, as a secondary, objective. So Europe now is able to deal with its own problems, even when it comes to Russia.
Okay, so Michael, another huge issue, of course, is the Iran nuclear deal. Biden, as candidate, has said he would re-enter the deal. There was a lot of hope when he first came into office. He probably found that the roadblocks that Trump placed for him with the newer sanctions that Donald Trump had placed since walking away from the deal, that those are a lot tougher to overcome, as the Iranians want to happen essentially overnight in one go. What are your thoughts about where that is headed as well? Because that's a huge issue, again, that goes back to the argument I made all the way at the beginning about the fact that many people are concerned about continuity on the part of U.S. foreign policy. What's to say if Biden today, for example, were through executive order, for example, re-enter the Iran nuclear deal? What's to say 4 years down the road, if we have a Republican come into office, that he or she would not simply, as Donald Trump did, walk away from it?
Yeah, and that could be one area where you see a real difference between Biden and Trump. On the other hand, I think the Biden administration has both been painted into a corner and painted itself into a corner in terms of moving forward with the re-engagement of Iran. And by that, I mean, there have been important critiques of the original JCPOA, including non-nuclear issues like Iranian ballistic missiles and also Iranian activity, in Yemen and in Syria, that people have attached to moving forward with the re-engagement of Iran. And particularly if the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia are going to have a bigger say in a new JCPOA or a re-engagement, it's going to be a much longer process to get back to where we were before. And it, in effect, would be a somewhat different agreement. And so it's going to be hard, I think, for the Biden administration just to, wind back the clock to 2016. I think it's going to take longer to re-engage with Iran. And in re-engaging with Iran, a lot of the Republican critique of the JCPOA is going to have to be a part of a new agreement or a revised agreement moving forward.
Many people around the world would see what happened with the Iran nuclear deal as testament to the fact that the U.S. cannot be trusted in some ways, as in, what I said earlier to Michael, what's to say 4 years down the road another president doesn't change his or her mind about what suits him or her when it comes to the Iran nuclear deal. And that then just, shows this level of instability almost, right, when it comes to such policies, which are really important. I mean, for security in the Middle East, for example, in the U.S.'s own words, this sort of deal is vital.
Well, the one thing that needs to be clarified here, the Iran deal is not a treaty. So it was not approved by the U.S. Senate, and there was no political consensus in the U.S. about that. So the Iranians, in this case, they were very well aware that, being an executive agreement would simply, make it vulnerable to, future actions of the president. So in this case, President Trump decided to basically get rid of that executive agreement because it was not a treaty. There was not a consensus. And the real issue, I think, when it comes to this Iran U.S. deal is that you have domestic politics interfering with foreign politics, with foreign policy, and that's a problem on both sides. You have the Iran deal, which has become a problem, a political issue in the U.S., but at the same time, Iran behaves in a way to not simply advance its foreign policy, but also to appeal to the voters in Iran, to the Iranian people. The regime very often kind of mixes them together, foreign policy and domestic policy as well. But in this case, both countries have kind of mixed domestic and foreign policy when it comes to the deal. So that's why it is so hard, and I would say probably even impossible. Because in the case of the U.S., it is politics that drives that decision, whether to basically go back to the deal or not. Because that might be used against the Democrats here, in the next, elections. And they are afraid to do that. So that it is that fear that kind of prevents the U.S., President Biden in this case, from kind of going back and kind of cut a new deal. And also on the other side, you have the Iranian fear that, we need to also appeal to our, people in Iran. They don't want the regime to look kind of weak, in confrontation with the U.S. So you have these kind of political, domestic politics, issues involved that kind of makes it harder, for not saying impossible, for them to kind of reach an agreement.
Very well. If there's a final word, unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us, but we really appreciate both Bledar and Michael for taking their time out this morning, speaking to us respectively from Florida and Indiana. We were discussing there Donald Trump's, but in fact, Joe Biden's first 100 days in office, though very much overshadowed by Donald Trump's policies during his years as U.S. president. When it comes to the Iran nuclear deal, certainly. When it comes to relations with Europe, certainly as well. Maybe things have irrevocably changed in many of those regards, as our guest there alluded to as well. And maybe that's the entire point. Maybe the point was to continue those policies anyhow on the foreign policy front, I'm saying, but to do so with a different guise, with a different PR, with better PR, if I may use that phrase as well. When it comes to Afghanistan, Joe Biden is essentially doing what Donald Trump wanted him to do and wanted to have happened, even though he's postponed that withdrawal by a bit. On the Iran nuclear deal too, I mean, there's no guarantees at this point that Biden will actually succeed in what he wanted to, or what he said he wanted to do as candidate. He's probably finding that things are a lot more different since the Trump administration walked away from the deal altogether. I mean, there's a whole host of issues here. The pivot to Asia as well that Barack Obama had begun during his years as president is also a vital factor in U.S. foreign policy making going forward. I'll be back with my final segment, I should say, after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar, Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to continue to discuss France, as we have at previous times in this show as well. We're going to talk about an open letter which was signed by many former generals, military generals, that is, of the French military, as well as possibly some serving members of the French army also. It has caused an uproar because this essentially warned of a possible civil war in the country. And now what's interesting is the reasoning behind why these people think that there may be a civil war. They point to the likes of the term Islamism or Islamists, as well as banlieues, or the suburbs around Paris and otherwise, which have always been seen as, of course, more populated by immigrant communities. What does this mean about how right-wing things are becoming in France? Because this was released, this open letter was released in a right-wing media organization, the Valeurs Actuelles. It's been supported even by Marine Le Pen, the National Front leader, even though the government in and of itself has said this is wrong, that there will in fact be punishment for those who have served and or are serving in the military, because French law requires serving members, and I believe even former serving members, to be politically neutral at all times. Let's discuss all of this a bit further. And I join with Dr. Paul Smith, who is an associate professor of French and Francophone studies at the University of Nottingham. He's joining us today from Nottingham. Joining us today from the French capital, Paris, is Amivi-Sika Dogbolo, who is pursuing a master's in sociology and management. Amivi-Sika and Paul, thank you both for taking our time out to join us today. Amivi-Sika, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of this open letter? What do you make of the warning of civil war?
Yes. First of all, I really want to say that they are describing a reality that doesn't exist. Because it's really important to say that some of us military, of us generals, are already retired or discharged soldiers. And moreover, some of them did a demonstration, against migrants a few months ago. So it's really important to understand that. And moreover, Valeurs Actuelles, the daily who posted this letter, is daily from extreme right wing. It's not only white; it's extreme right wing. So it's a party that divide and sow hatred in the country. So I think that nowadays minorities like Islamist people, not Islam people, and people from the minorities talk about what they are living, and now some people doesn't like that because they speak openly about something that disturbs them. So that's why they're saying that we are facing a threat of civil war. But the truth is, people are just living their life and speak openly about what they are living. So for me, it's not really a threat. It's just some people who are angry.
Okay. Paul, what are your thoughts about this? Because, it certainly does strike one as quite disturbing, the direction that France has been moving in anyhow, but then to come out with such a letter and to blame basically Muslims. I mean, they're using the word Islamist, but I imagine that the real goal is to just label Muslims. And then secondly, banlieues as a whole. I mean, it's not like both of the above have not been in France for many, many, many years, for generations even, in fact. What do you make of the whole issue?
Well, I think that it's a confluence of moments and events. It's exactly as Amivi-Sika has said, that in many ways they're describing something that doesn't exist. But there is what has happened over the last few years in France is that the political discourse has been shifted by the far right, and you even find then that the government is passing laws, attempting to pass legislation on what it calls separatism, tackling what in French is known as communautarisme. So it's kind of moved towards a discourse of the right, of the far right, that kind of creates a situation of fear. It plays up on that, and so there's that is part of the broad context, the discourse of what the French call insécurité, the feeling of a lack of safety within France or at France's frontiers, or for French soldiers fighting abroad. That's kind of being that's being stoked up by the far right. The government moves to try and counter that with other legislation. There's also the situation, the response in France to the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been one of consternation, of not really understanding what it's about. Even really quite progressive people who don't really quite understand what this movement is about. And again, as your other correspondent has said, when people in France are saying, actually, France is not very different from what happens in some places in the United States, there's this kind of shock horror. We have liberté, égalité, fraternité. But when somebody says that doesn't actually play out, then there's kind of a reaction to that. Yeah. So there's that broad, if you like, context into which this fits. And then, as you've heard, the organisers of the original letter are actually linked to far-right organisations, in fact, even further to the right than Le Pen's Rassemblement National. And some of them have been involved again in protests against immigrants. And they've used and Valeurs Actuelles is part of this kind of far right-wing nexus. And they used the anniversary, very deliberately, the 21st of April, the anniversary of the Putsch des Généraux, to launch this appeal.
Sika, I wonder, I was reading somewhere that possibly around 58%, if I could find it right now, is the number of French people who were surveyed about this letter and its findings and its concerns, saying that in fact they agree with a lot of what these military generals have said. Do you get the feeling that a lot of this is down to fear, as Paul there said, that there's this fear being created in society about immigrants, about minorities, about everybody who is basically not the standard French person in many people's eyes?
Really, I don't live this reality because I don't live that. For me, when I'm living in Paris, so we are a lot of people the immigration. So I live in peace. I can talk about what I'm living. I can talk about anti-racism, about Black Lives Matter. I talk about that often, and I can talk about this really, freely, and people understand what I really want to say. It's just like a minority of people who really don't want to hear us because they just seen us as separatists. But it's really, I don't know, I don't understand why they are seeing us like that, because anti-racism movement, it's the fight for equality and for freedom and for peace. So now we are accused to be violent and to sow hatred in the country. And it's not the thing we want. We just want peace and people to be happy in France. So I don't know where did you find these numbers, but I don't feel like 58% of the country agreed with them.
Okay, Paul, I'm not being able to find the actual poll right now. I had come across it today while doing the research. But nevertheless, I mean, the point that I'm trying to make in Amivi-Sika is, of course, correct, that I don't want to generalize every French person as being racist. Certainly, that's not my goal. But what I'm trying to get to is, do you think that the fear that you spoke of as well, that that's working? Do you think that that is swaying opinions of enough of the French people that they would vote ever more right-wing and hold ever more right-wing views?
I think it's in today's Valeurs Actuelles, or yesterday they printed that figure. They've been under pressure, and so they're kind of just trying to justify themselves. This is, of course, the agenda that Le Pen wants. Okay, it's the agenda that Le Pen wants for as we come out of the pandemic, or as France comes out of the pandemic, going into the presidential election next year, as you said in your lead-in. This is where Le Pen wants to set the agenda. The problem is, it seems to me, is that Macron is not only letting her set that agenda, but he's also playing into that agenda. And I absolutely agree with Amivi that, you know, more than half of French people are not racist. That, you know, people go about their lives, their daily lives, in a perfectly normal way. It's not the sense that I have, but there are people in France who want to move the agenda there, who want to use easy labels, the threat of fundamentalism, whatever that means. You know, the idea of I mean, some of these generals have been implicated in identitarian movements, are linked to movements which talk about the Great Replacement. So this is where they want to situate the agenda. And as you yourself said, you know, Le Pen has said these people are speaking sense. You know, she's clearly settling herself there in that part of the debate.
Yeah, and I found that Amivi-Sika as well that I was referring to. It's an LCI TV report that was conducted on Thursday, in fact, that showed that 58% of French people agree with the sentiments in the letter. But I don't want to just, you know, talk about necessarily, you know, whether a majority or not agrees with this, but this does then frame the political debate in the country, right? Is this, Amivi, in a sense, do you think, a distraction from the other issues possibly that the country is actually facing?
Yes, because I don't know if you know, but a few weeks ago, a law passed, and it's like Muslim women who have the veil. This law said that these mothers can't go to school. I don't know how to say it in English, but sometimes with the school, the students can go to the museum or the cinema, and like these mothers who have the veil can't go with their children to the museum or to the cinema. Now it's forbidden because they said that the veil is against the values of French people. And I really don't understand that, because now we are living a crisis, the coronavirus crisis, and all the laws that, all the subject that we are talking about in the medias are always about Islam and anti-racism. Always. And they always criticize Muslim people, and they always criticize anti-racism movements. And I think it's really, really sad, because it's not normal that, because we are dividing people. We are so hatred and we are dividing people, and it works. because I'm really afraid that Marine Le Pen will win the election in 2 years, in 1 year now. Sorry.
Yeah.
So yes, I'm really afraid because it works and people really listen to what they say, and sometimes it works, and I'm really afraid for my country.
Well, we'll leave there as a final comment, but we really appreciate both Amivi-Sika and Paul for taking their time out and for discussing the latest news coming out of France there. Ex-generals possibly to face sanctions of some sort because they've penned this open letter warning of civil war in the country. They've blamed Islamists, quote unquote, of course, as well as the people in banlieues or those suburbs where mostly immigrants do live. The anti-migrant, anti-Islam/Muslim feeling in the country continues to grow. That doesn't, of course, mean that we paint all French citizens with this broad brush of being racist overall. Nevertheless, it is, though, the outline of the political debate that continues to occur within France over French values of acceptance. Maybe that value is becoming less and less important, in fact, to the French, or to some French at the very least. Does this mean somebody like Marine Le Pen could possibly win in the elections? I mean, certainly her numbers are not low. She does have significant support, and that's why Macron is being pushed also in this ever more right-wing direction. We will, of course, as we always have, keep a very close eye on the situation they're developing in France. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.